For 35 days, Iran's new supreme leader was a written statement without a body. No image, no real public appearance, no authoritative speech that could anchor the country in the middle of the most dangerous succession crisis the Islamic Republic has faced in decades. The man at the top of the system was absent while the system was bleeding in every direction. That is not a side detail in this story. That is the story, because the real crisis inside Iran right now is not simply that mass protests have erupted, or that the economy is in terrible condition, or that the IRGC is furious, or that the clergy feels itself being pushed aside. The real crisis is that all of those things are now happening under an invisible supreme leader. And invisible supreme leaders do not stabilize authoritarian systems. They expose the vacuum at the apex. That vacuum is now swallowing the republic. You can see it if you start in the right place, not in the street, not even in the economy. Start at the very top of the system and ask the one question that matters in any authoritarian order who is visibly in charge at the moment of maximum stress. The official answer is Mojtaba Khamenei. The operational answer, according to this source, is a three-man committee of IRGC origin. That difference tells you everything, because states like Iran do not fall apart first by losing territory. They first lose clarity. The line from symbol to command, from office to order, from authority to execution starts to blur. The public face remains, the formal titles remain, the speeches continue, the slogans continue, but the actual chain of command slips away from the place where the state claims it lives. That is what is happening. Now, Vahedi Zolgadar Mohsen, Rezai, men of war, security, and revolutionary force, rather than clerical legitimacy, men who were not elected, not chosen by popular consent, and not designed to embody theological continuity. Yet they are now described as the real governing mechanism of the state, not through constitutional succession, not through a public transfer ceremony, but through default, through crisis, through vacancy above them. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. Iran is not just experiencing unrest, it is experiencing a succession vacuum that the security state is filling before the formal system can admit that the vacuum exists. The immediate trigger, the one that seems to have cracked everything open, was the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. The source material treats this as the political death blow to the regime's psychological framework, and I think that is right, Iran. Power was never only missiles, militias, and repression. It was also theater, narrative, and disciplined self-image. 7 years of telling supporters that the republic does not bow, does not surrender, does not yield its last pressure card for nothing. Then the strait was reopened without visible gain. And once that happened, the vacuum at the top became much harder to hide. Why? Because visible concession demands visible authority. If a regime is going to give something up, it needs someone at the apex who can explain why, absorb the blame, reshape the narrative, and tell the hardliners, the security apparatus, the clergy, and the public that this retreat is in fact a strategic move. It needs a body in the room, a voice, a face, a center. Iran had none. So the concession was not metabolized, it detonated. The guards saw leverage surrendered. Hardliners saw humiliation. The public saw years of sacrifice turned into nothing. And the leader, who should have been able to impose one coherent explanation on all these audiences at once, was nowhere to be seen. That is why the crisis accelerated so quickly. Not simply because the state made a mistake, but because it made the mistake under an absent ruler. Once that happens, every fracture underneath the throne starts moving at once. The first fracture is between the formal civilian institutions and the guard. President Pezeshkian remains in office, but the source leaves little doubt that he is not setting the real line. Cabinet power is constrained, public gestures are reversed, even basic state messaging gets overwhelmed by the security structure. This is not the old Iranian model of a complicated hybrid republic in which civilians, clerics, technocrats, and security men constantly maneuver. This is a more advanced stage. The civilians are still visible, but they are no longer the center of gravity. The second fracture is between the guard and the clergy. This one is perhaps even more destabilizing because it strikes at the founding formula of the Islamic Republic. The state was supposed to be governed through clerical legitimacy. That was the grand claim. Not merely force, but force justified by theology. Not merely power, but power sanctified by doctrine. If a military committee can now run the country while the supreme leader is absent and the clerics watch from the side, then the old formula begins to look hollow. That is why the source correctly describes theocracy as being replaced in visible stages by military dictatorship. And for the clergy, that is not just a loss of influence, it is an existential exposure. Because if the state can function without meaningful clerical command at the center, then all the pain imposed for decades in the name clerical rule begins to look like theater for a different system entirely. The third fracture is the one in society itself. Here again, the missing leader matters. Economic pain in an authoritarian system is sometimes survivable if a coherent center still exists to convert pain into meaning. The public may hate the hardship, but if the regime can still project certainty, still project destiny, still project purpose, it can often contain rage for much longer than outsiders expect. Iran now has blackouts, fuel queues, medicine shortages, price shocks, suspended treatment, empty ATMs, and a resistance economy that has been exposed as slogan rather than shelter. At the same time, the symbolic center that should be translating pain into purpose is absent. That is when the public begins to ask a different question. Not how much more can we endure, but what exactly are we enduring for? And once that question takes hold, slogans start dying very quickly. That is part of what makes the protest movement described in the source so dangerous. It is not only anger, it is revision. The chants for the Shah matter because they do not simply demand reform or relief, they reverse the founding myth. The entire regime was built on the destruction of the monarchy and the claim that history had moved in one irreversible direction. When people start chanting for the return of what the revolution replaced, they are not only criticizing the current order, they are declaring that the revolution may have been a wrong turn. That is much harder to crush than a normal protest demand because it is not a policy complaint, it is a civilizational insult to the state's origin story. Now place all of that under an invisible supreme leader. This is why the vacuum at the apex is so central. It is not a mere problem of optics. It is not just that Mojtaba looks weak because he has not appeared. It is that every other actor in the system now has to operate without a visible final source of authority. The president cannot stabilize the regime because everyone knows he is not the center. The clerics cannot stabilize the regime because the guard is moving around them. The guard cannot fully stabilize the regime because parts of the guard are now consumed by distrust, paranoia, and the sense that the top itself may be compromised, weakened, or unusable. That internal paranoia is one of the most revealing parts of the whole source text commanders reducing communication. Channels, tightening, questions of infiltration spreading through the security structure itself. That is the kind of thing outsiders often underestimate because it is less spectacular than mass protest footage. But in hard states, internal distrust among the guardians is often more dangerous than rage in the streets. Streets can be shot. Networks of command cannot easily be restored once everyone in them begins to suspect everyone else. And then comes the most explosive detail in the whole piece. The idea that senior IRGC figures are now privately circulating the demand that the supreme leader should resign. Once that sentence becomes imaginable, the entire psychological architecture of the Islamic Republic changes, because the guard was not supposed to challenge the supreme leader. It was supposed to embody and enforce him. The organization existed to defend the apex, not to question whether the apex had become an obstacle. The moment the Praetorian institution starts calculating that leadership itself may need to be removed for the system to survive, the system has already entered a different category of danger. This is not yet a public coup. It is more unstable than that. It is the phase before a coup, before a purge, before a forced retirement, before a managed retreat, before a silent succession rewrite, when the people who actually hold coercive power start converging on the same thought privately. While the formal structure still pretends nothing fundamental has changed, history is full of regimes that died in exactly that interval. Not when the first protesters appeared, not when the first shortages hit, not when the first official was overruled, but when the men who were supposed to hold the line began quietly deciding the line was no longer worth holding for the person at the top. That is why this story is bigger than protests, bigger than Mojtaba, bigger even than the guard. What is really in motion here is the collapse of simultaneity in a functioning revolutionary state. The leadership, the ideology, the coercive apparatus, and the loyal social base do not all need to be happy, but they do need to move in the same historical direction. They need to believe, however unequally, that the system still knows what it is and why it exists. Iran no longer seems to have that. The leader is absent. The committee is ruling by default. The clerics are being displaced. The president is constrained. The public is furious. The economy is failing. The guard is suspicious of itself. The founding story is being mocked by reality. That is not a regime handling pressure. That is a regime losing simultaneity across all the layers that once made it coherent. And once simultaneity breaks, time becomes dangerous because every next event begins to hit a system that is no longer synchronized. A new protest wave lands on top of leadership absent. A new economic shock lands on top of theological hollowing. A new external strike lands on top of internal paranoia. A new elite quarrel lands on top of public disbelief. Nothing is processed cleanly. Everything multiplies the weakness already present elsewhere. That is how systems reach the threshold where they can still look intact from the outside while already failing in substance. So is Iran there? Now, the honest answer is that no one can say with certainty whether the collapse event is imminent, but the source is right about something more important than prediction. It is right that the Republic is no longer operating with the kind of unified authority that allowed it to survive earlier crises. In 1989, the transition after Khomeini's death was rapid, managed, and embodied. The system had a center. Today, the system has a vacuum that others are trying to manage around. That is much more dangerous because the strongest regimes can survive pressure if the top remains visible, decisive, and believable. Weakening regimes often survive a little longer than expected because they still have the shell at the top. But once the apex becomes invisible and contested at the same time, every lower layer begins to recalculate. And then the question changes. It is no longer, can the regime suppress the protests? It becomes, who still believes enough in the regime to suppress them forever? That is the question now hanging over Tehran. And that is why I would end here. A system like this does not die the moment the streets erupt. It dies the moment the throne goes dark and everyone underneath it begins acting as if the dark may be permanent.